Welcome to Shareholders of a Better World, brought to you by TBLI Group. At TBLI Group, we have an established reputation as an organization dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now, let me introduce my guest today.
Good afternoon from our studio in Amsterdam. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, just some household explanation. For those of you who've never joined before, if you need to ask a question or a comment, just type it in the lower right-hand corner. If you want to applaud or you find something funny or brilliant, there are 3 emojis that you can press, and that will highlight your feelings. If you have something really compelling and you need to grab the mic and join the panel on stage, just press the microphone next to your name. And if you need to send a private message, just move your mouse over the person's photo and a window will pop up and you can then send them a private message. So I'm extremely happy and fortunate today because we have a real mega thought leader in the whole climate change and technology space. James Arbib is the co-founder of RethinkX, and chairman of a family office. He was also a very active investor in clean tech and sustainability. And when we were chatting the other day, I felt very enthusiastic and actually less frightful of the future, because a lot of the solutions to climate seem to be there, and he was able to kind of put them all in a compact row. So, Jamie, thank you so much for joining us. And just so people know who you are, if they're from another planet and they have never heard of you, tell a little bit about who you are and what does RethinkX do, and your activity in the sustainable and addressing basically climate change.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Robert, and it's great to be here today. So yeah, a little bit of background. So I've spent most of my career as an investor. I spent 15 or so years in clean technology investment. Also spent a period of time alongside that with a foundation that I set up that was looking to solve environmental problems. We were particularly focused on the finance system and looking at ways in which we could help drive capital, from the old system into the new emerging system. And about 10 years ago or so, I guess, I got very frustrated with the environmental narrative, the kind of doom and gloom behind it. And I also had a feeling at that point in time that we were doing ourselves a disservice, that clean energy had a number of cards that we could play in its favor beyond just the environmental benefit of clean energy. If you knew anything about cost curves, even 10 years ago, it was clear that if they carried on the same trajectory, that the economics of clean energy and electric vehicles, for instance, would begin to outcompete, fossil fuel, gasoline vehicles and conventional power systems. So there were economic benefits, but there were also benefits in terms of kind of energy security, national security, even at some level, as well as resilience benefits and so on. And as environmentalists, we were just playing the one card, the environmental card. And that was causing kind of polarization in the debate, certainly in the US. There was a kind of conflation between clean energy and a kind of top-down, government intervention approach that alienated a lot of conservatives, and it didn't need to. Was my feeling, and I ended up anyway in a kind of strange series of events that I won't bore you with. I ended up being asked along to speak to the U.S. military, who were running a scenario planning exercise, and they were asking the question, what will it mean for geopolitics if we get off fossil fuels quicker than we're expecting? And as part of that scenario planning exercise, they invited 10 experts along to speak to them, and they had a group of experts from kind of big, august institutions, big, major oil companies. The State Department were there, big NGOs that you would recognize, and all of them pretty much had the same forecast for the adoption of solar PV and electric vehicles. There were these sort of straight line forecasts out into the future, forecasting maybe even by 2050, 10 or 20% adoption of solar PV and electric vehicles and so on. And this guy called Tony Sebo got up halfway through this day, and he said, well, that's not how technology disruptions happen. They're not these kind of, slow incremental progressions. They're rapid, they're non-linear. It's the S-curve of technology adoption. And, these things are over by the 2030s. And if you guys are going to make your plans based on these sort of faulty analysis, on this faulty analysis, you're going to make some major mistakes. And I basically said the same thing. And Tony and I, anyway, ended up going out for coffee afterwards and speaking for months about everything from education to healthcare to food and agriculture and obviously energy and transport, about how we were on the cusp of transformation of some foundational sectors of our economy. And yet we are totally unaware of the speed at which these would happen, but also the scale of the impact of these transformations. And so, we after a few months felt we had no choice but to set up a research group that could properly model and understand the complexity of technology transformations. And that's what RethinkX became. We're a not-for-profit research group. And our mission is really to provide decision makers, whether they're policymakers, investors, business, or civic leaders, with better data analysis that captures the possibilities that are emerging. So that's really the background to what we're doing.
But if you look at when we chatted, you gave a whole litany of solutions that are there, and that the time frame where they will really kick in. Many people think that we should just be pricing carbon, get a carbon tax in place, and the rest will happen. Do you think we need a carbon tax?
A carbon tax can accelerate things, Robert. But let's step back for a moment, and if you give me a moment, maybe I can explain what we're doing differently, and that might throw some insight on how we differ from most of the mainstream analysis that you see from governments, from NGOs, from Wall Street, because the models that we tend to use to try and forecast the future, they're what we term equilibrium models. Okay, so any complex system, whether it's a climate system, it's a sector of the economy, it's an ecosystem, the human body, you name it, the dynamics of change are similar, right? And so what you get these long periods of incremental progress with the systems in an equilibrium state, right? And it's held in equilibrium by a series of constraining feedback loops, negative feedback loops that act to resist change to that system. But at certain points in time, those systems can transform very rapidly into another system state, right? And that's driven by accelerating feedback loops. So accelerating feedbacks begin to take over from the negative feedback loops and drive that kind of S curve of technology disruption, but also the S curve that you see. That's, if we think of the climate system, right? This is a great example of these dynamics at work. So we're in a period of time now where we're in an equilibrium state, right? So there are a number of negative feedback loops that are keeping our climate relatively stable. Okay, so we emit huge quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but the majority of them are sucked up by the ocean or by plant growth. And there are a number of other negative feedback loops. And so, the increase in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases has actually been less than we would have expected if all else was equal, right, in the absence of those feedback loops. But what we're really worried about with climate change is that we pass a certain threshold. And past that threshold, those negative feedback loops begin to break down. And we see these accelerating feedback loops take over. So as greenhouse gas concentrations rise to a certain threshold and the temperature rises, we might see, the Arctic ice melt, and we trap more energy in the Earth's atmosphere, or the Arctic tundra melt and release methane. And those are accelerating feedback loops that leads to that non-linearity, that leads to runaway climate change, essentially. And the climate system will shift very quickly into a different state over just a few decades. And that's what's so terrifying about climate change. But the same dynamics are at work, in a sector of the economy. So you look at transport or energy or food and agriculture, and the system has been the same for 100 or so years. The business model, the infrastructure, the basis of the system, the incentives, the metrics we use to measure, and so on and so forth. Yes, we've had huge expansion and huge technological development, but within a stable system. And so equilibrium analysis, basically, it looks at change to a variable, say, but assumes everything else is equal. It's a sort of extrapolation of the present into the future. And in the equilibrium phase, that's fine. It's not a bad approximation for the future. You can kind of extrapolate out 10 or 20 years, and you're not going to be terribly wrong. But as you come up to one of these points of disruption, this point where the system is getting pushed out of equilibrium, and you've got the S-curve of technology disruption, it becomes woefully inadequate and leads to these kind of very, very faulty forecasts. And so, we underestimate the speed of change, but also the impact of change and the impact on other connected systems. And so that's what we're trying to correct for. So the analysis we do are essentially complex systems analysis that capture these systems dynamics, these feedback loops, and so on, and understand how quickly and profoundly individual sectors of the economy can be transformed, and how these sectors of the economy interact with each other, and how the effects ripple out. So we're beginning to write a series of reports on climate change, which we published last year, but also on issues like social issues or geopolitics and so on, which are also about to be profoundly transformed by the transformation of our economy.
But I heard a figure that if you increase soil concentration, CO2 by 2 additional %, you can offset all of climate risk. And another friend of mine was doing blue carbon, which is restoring coastal areas to allow kelp to grow. Is that true? Is it true? Or we just have to increase the soil concentration by restoring the health of the soil 2%, we're covered?
I mean, possibly. There are a number of mechanisms through which we can do that, right? So most of our land is used for agriculture, right? And most of that land is used for livestock farming, right? Either as pasture land or to produce feed for animals. And what we're seeing in that part of the economy is just an extraordinary transformation that's going to hit us in just a handful of years. So, we now have the ability to produce proteins or any complex organic molecule without growing the whole plant or the whole animal, right? So precision fermentation is a key technology here. It's really a combination of precision biology and fermentation. So what we're doing essentially are hacking microbes to essentially produce as an output any complex organic molecule that we want. So the first molecule that was produced through this methodology was back in the 1980s was human insulin, right? A better product than insulin that used to come from the pancreas of a pig or a cow, but also now vastly cheaper. So the first kilo of human insulin produced cost about $1 billion. And then, by 2000, it was down to $1 million. And today we're well under $100 in terms of producing, a kilo of proteins. And it's on track by the middle of this decade to be competitive with bulk proteins from animals, and then will continue to drop, right? And so that's becoming competitive. And as that happens, what we'll see is a replacement of livestock farming, because the new ways of producing food will not just be, almost an order of magnitude cheaper, but better on every parameter, better for animal welfare, better for the environment, better for our health, better in terms of kind of pathogens and so on and so forth. So on almost better for food security, and a much more kind of localized and distributed system. And so as we disrupt animal agriculture, we'll have huge swathes of land. We calculate by the mid-2030s, an area the size of China, America, and Australia combined will be freed from livestock farming. And that gives us an extraordinary potential then to use that land to sequester carbon in a natural way. So even in a do-nothing scenario where you just leave that land alone, we calculate that about 20% of today's emissions could be offset. But if we choose to actively reforest or even rewild that land, we can increase that figure dramatically. We have incredible options to, and don't forget, we'd also see the emissions from our economy drop dramatically over that timescale, because we're going to see a disruption to our energy sector and a disruption to our transportation sector, and of course a disruption to the food sector alongside. So those three disruptions together are responsible for about 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions today. So you can begin to see how we have the tools available to us to be able to solve climate change. And yes, the soils are a big piece of that. But the very same technologies that disrupt livestock farming also disrupt fisheries. We'll be able to produce fish meat without growing the fish, without basically strip mining our oceans for food. And we'll be able to just leave the oceans alone to regenerate. And we actually have no idea. There's very little science that looks at what the potential for ocean regeneration is if we just get out of the way and leave them alone. But these are disruptions that are really driven by the economics of these new technologies, right? So these are market forces. In some ways, I think of it as, what we need to do. You imagine a kind of boulder at the top of the hill, and what we need to do is get that boulder running down the hill, and that's the market forces that will lead to the disruption of these of these technologies. And we need to make sure as the boulder rushes down that hill that it doesn't cause, go down the wrong avenue or cause, any unforeseen damage. But that's the challenge of regulation and legislation in some ways, is to get that boulder rolling, to get it to the start line where these economic forces are a tailwind. Because right now in our perception today, it's a headwind. It's like trying to push a boulder up the hill. When we think about solving climate change, we see it as an insoluble problem. So we need every tool at our disposal to push that boulder up the hill. And in our view, that's just a misconception of how we need to go about solving climate change. So that we have the tools. We just need to ensure that they're adopted and that they don't cause kind of adverse consequences as they are.
And how do we prevent the boulder from rolling back down over us and making a bigger mess? I mean, because we spoke a lot about efficiency, technology efficiency, but at the same time, you'll have driverless cars and driverless planes maybe, and driverless trucks, and you won't have, truck drivers blocking bridges anymore, which means a lot of people will be unemployed. And, what is the opportunity on the social side to create the vast number of jobs? I mean, small scale agriculture is still the largest employer. Hospitality is the second largest. Is everybody going to be working in hotels?
Yeah. So I mean, we wrote a book. We published a couple of summers ago called Rethinking Humanity that looks at some of these issues, looks at the transformation at a societal or at a civilization level. And you're right, there are going to be profound consequences here as we disrupt. In many ways, we should think about it as the old system of production across every sector of the economy is what we think of as a system based on extraction and exploitation of scarce resources. And I include labor as one of those resources. If you think of the inputs into the economy as land, labor, and capital, essentially resources and labor, we're all part of that system of production. And it's And it's really a kind of extraction and exploitation based system. If you look at any civilization through history, what you see is that they expand to the limits of their technological capabilities to harness, the materials and so on that they need to support that civilization. And it's kind of zero-sum competition in that world. There's this sort of competitive dynamic, or what we call a growth imperative, where you either have to grow or you get outgrown. You exploit or you get exploited. So, societies that historically have tried to live, too sustainably or too equitably, have just been outcompeted by those that don't. And that's a dynamic that's kind of driven, the pattern of history that we've seen. And yes, the system we're seeing now emerge is a fundamentally different system. And that's one of the things that is misunderstood about disruption or transformation, is that it's not just a kind of technological substitution. It's a whole paradigm shift in the nature of the system. And so what we're seeing with the new emergent technologies across energy, across transportation, across food, across every other sector of the economy, is an end to that kind of model of extraction and exploitation that we've seen since the dawn of humanity, and the emergence of what we think of as a creation-based or a generation-based system of production. And what I mean by that is that the building blocks that we need to produce anything we need are available locally in abundance. So the electrons, the photons, the molecules, and so on, that we need to produce the food, the energy, and so on, are all available pretty much everywhere on the planet in abundance. So in many ways, both labor and resources are replaced as inputs into the economy, right? So we're no longer part of that system of production. So we'll sit outside. And so, what's transformative about this is that we will need to reimagine what we term our organizing system, the way we organize society, the way our institutions and governance structures, but also the way we think about work and reward, because the cost of the things we need are going to be so low, produced with such efficiency, that we can afford a totally different social contract. The concept of a universal basic income, for instance, which today would be ludicrously expensive to afford for a population as a whole, becomes entirely affordable out into the future. And we might have a different form of universal basic income. It might be a right to the things we need: 10,000 miles of travel, 2,000 calories a day, whatever. We might have a totally new social contract which transforms that, and we will do different things. We'll be involved much more in empathetic challenges or creative challenges, things that machinery finds much harder to do. So you're absolutely right. We are going to see a transformation of society, and we're not aware of what's coming, and we don't plan for it. Then yes, there are going to be some horrible adverse consequences. But there's real potential here, actually, to be able to mitigate those consequences as long as we see what's coming and have time to plan. I mean, farming communities, look like they might be decimated by this because they'll be outcompeted as a form of production by precision fermentation and these new methodologies of producing food. But actually, that very same land can be used for rewilding or reforesting. Exactly the same location, and requiring very similar skills, and we'll be able to afford to incentivize those communities to essentially steward the land, and so we'll create jobs in that respect. And that's a much healthier transformation than what's happened historically, where we kind of stumble into disruption without seeing it and kind of clear up the mess retrospectively. All the jobs and livelihoods that are destroyed in one industry, and the new jobs that are created are, require different skills in different geographic locations. And it's been an absolute mess. So we do have the potential to allow, people to thrive through this, but we won't get there if we don't, rethink really some very basic concepts about how we govern and run our societies.
You mentioned the UBI, Universal Basic Income. Interesting you mentioned that, because this week someone came to me with a solution of also securitizing that for everyone on a large scale. But we have now, according to Credit Suisse, if they're accurate, almost 4.4 times wealth versus GDP. So there's 440% more money, wealth running around than actual activity. Yet, this should be ideal to push the UBI. But at the same time, I've never seen such a degree of lack of empathy by the uber wealthy who go to vast efforts to even keep the 100 billion or 200 billion or whatever it is. So yes, I agree that that can come, but at the same time, I don't see the kind of the empathetic idea of let's share.
No, I mean, I entirely agree with you, and I think, I think what, ultimately what we're saying is that this is, a bottom-up emergent process here. That even our conception of kind of centralized government will shift over time if we're successful. So what our research is really doing is showing what the possibilities are out in the future, right? And we're saying, look, as a system comes out of equilibrium, we're reaching that point across every sector of the economy and for society more generally. The possibility space expands massively, right? So we're no longer constrained essentially by those negative feedback loops. That what's not possible is that we just continue as we are into the future, right? Our current system just that's not an option. The option is either that we make the adaptations and seize the possibilities, or somehow we crash and have a much more kind of dystopian outcome. And that's kind of what dark ages are about, that where civilizations essentially break down and they can't handle the kind of change that comes at them. And so, that's really the challenge. But it's going to be this bottom-up process if we're going to get there, because this system that's emerging is far more distributed, right? Far more networked, far more localized. And I think we'll need to reorganize our communities and our societies around the nature of that nature of the production system. And so, yes, I think it's a worry that we see this lack of empathy and so on and so forth. But that's kind of the old system breaking down. And that's something that kind of happened, it has to happen to allow the new system to emerge. And what we're concerned is to work with those groups and those communities and those regions that are enabling the conditions in which that new system can emerge. If we get it right, then what we'll find is that old system breaks down. There is a new emergent system there, ready and waiting to take its place. But yeah, it's going to be choppy. It's going to be an uncomfortable ride, and a lot of one of the feedback loops that's always hampered this kind of transformation in the past is that as things get unstable, as the world gets increasingly certain, we tend to look for safety and stability. We tend to go back and cling on to what we think works, in the old system. And we see that happening. We've seen it happening time and again. We see calls for more priests or more blood sacrifice or bigger walls in prior civilizations. The echoes of that are happening today. And so actually, just as we need adaptability across society, we lose it. We find, you're seeing the polarization that makes any kind of major change impossible in most of the Western world. And so, that's constraining our ability to adapt. But it's kind of, as Buckminster Fuller says, if you want to transform a system, or build a new system that outcompetes it. And I think that's very much the attitude here, is that we don't think we get that. What we need to do is kind of patch up the old system and keep it alive long enough. But really, it's a new system that will outcompete the old ultimately.
So to paraphrase Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, it's only castles burning.
Yeah.
You maybe you're privately incredibly pessimistic, but you seem very optimistic because you have confidence in the kind of the rationale of a system that works more efficiently. We'll have 3 continents to sequester carbon because we'll be producing food more efficiently. What worries you, or what in the short term?
Yeah, what worries me is our inability to see what's possible, right? So without that kind of North Star of, without an understanding of where we can get to and how quickly we can get there, we're going to do some dumb stuff, right? And we see that happening already. I mean, there are interventions, for instance, aimed at solving climate change that I think are actually deeply unhelpful. Actually will constrain our ability to solve climate change. So, I mean, there's a guy called David Deutsch, who's the founder of quantum computing, the father of quantum computing. He wrote this amazing book called The Beginning of Infinity, which I'd encourage everyone to read. But what he says in that book is, he says that the only thing that's truly sustainable is progress, right? Stable or steady state societies are inherently unsustainable, right? And there's a kind of irony to that, because in a lot of our environmental interventions are about, giving up stuff, about behavior change, about giving up consumption. Sorry, I have to move because.
Okay, that's all right. That's all right. It'll come back.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second. Here we go. So sorry about that. The idea that we can solve climate change through giving up consumption, for instance, through behavior change, I mean, for me is lunacy at some level. That somehow we're going to be able to give up consumption enough to reduce emissions to the level that we solve climate change. We can't possibly give up consumption to get to zero. For instance, we certainly can't get below zero to repair the damage we've already done. And even getting halfway there or a quarter way there would cause such economic catastrophe that all the capital that we need to build a new food system, a new transport system, a new energy system would be destroyed. So it would be locked into the old system. And we'd extend its life by a few years for sure, but we wouldn't ultimately solve the problem. And so I think, my concern is that we do dumb stuff that stops us ultimately solving the problem. I mean, we'd essentially cut off the lifeboats, before we'd launched them. And so that worries me. But I am hugely optimistic because we have the potential to solve our problems. Not just our environmental problems, but our social problems and all kinds of problems that society faces together. Right. So in the current model, all these problems are in conflict. Our environmental, our economic, and our social problems are kind of in conflict with each other. It's kind of zero-sum competition between them. But in the new model, those tensions and those relationships don't exist, and we can solve them all together. And so I am an optimist, but I'm an optimist in terms of what's possible, but I'm a pessimist in terms of our human ability to realize it and take the right choices.
I'm going to take some questions because we actually have quite a few. Janelle Malte, one of our TBLI heroes, the youngest to ever become a TBLI hero. She wanted to know, what are the timelines on these transitions, disruptions, and given the hard deadlines on climate action, will they be in time?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. So if we look at transportation, so that's a great example, and we can see a transition. So the disruptions are kind of two-phase disruption in transportation. So the first phase is the replacement of gasoline vehicles with electric vehicles. The second phase is what we call transport as a service. It's when we get autonomous vehicles and we move away from car ownership and then into a model of kind of transport as a service, robo-taxis. Mm-hmm. And so, Tony Sieber, my co-founder, wrote a book called Clean Disruption in 2014. And, he drew a cost curve for electric vehicles and an adoption curve for the adoption of electric vehicles, which has been unbelievably accurate even today. So, what he saw was that by 2030, we'd see 100% or nearly 100% of new car sales being electric, right? And people laughed at him. He thought it was ludicrous. They thought it was ludicrous, and that was a crazily aggressive target. But what we've seen over the last couple of years is just an explosion of electric vehicle sales, and right on time according to his analysis. And what we're seeing, I think we saw last year something like 15% of new vehicles sold globally were electric. Right, that's an extraordinary jump from about 3% just a couple of years before, and it's on track I mean, it's somewhat supply constrained right now, but it's on track to follow that target. Because what happens, as we go down that S curve, these feedback loops kick in, right? And we're at the point where they're really kicking in. So, you get a virtuous cycle for the new industry where you get kind of increasing investment, increasing demand, increasing economies of scale, lower costs, leading to more demand. You get more regulatory support. Consumer opinion moves in favor of the new technologies. People get exposed to it and get used to it. So you get this series of feedback loops that make the new ever cheaper and ever better and ever and adopted ever quicker. And the old industry goes into the reverse, right? You see less investment. Exactly what we're seeing actually over the last couple of years. All the money being invested in transportation is going to electric and autonomous vehicles, right? That's a powerful feedback loop. And you see reversing economies of scale, reversing utilization of diminishing utilization of factories, increasing costs, right? We'll see gasoline vehicles increasing costs. And part of that will be driven by a used car price spiral, right? Where used car prices, gasoline prices begin to drop. We're in a kind of funny phase now, but we don't think this is far away. And that pushes up the cost of a new car because your lease payment is based on the based on the residual value of a car, right? So you get this series of negative feedback loops that are a vicious cycle for the incumbent industry. And so that's why the disruption goes so rapidly, and you get to almost complete penetration of the market. And we're seeing that unfold in front of our eyes. And once we get proper vehicle autonomy, we'll see that disruption disrupted by the new disruption because, transport as a service has the potential to be incredibly low cost, right? And that's really driven by, how efficient and how long electric vehicles last for, right? There are just no moving parts, right? So we're seeing batteries already designed and lasting for 1 million miles, right? And the rest of the vehicle also can, the motor and so on can also last for 1 million miles at least, right? And that transforms things because, in the private ownership model, it's kind of useless, right? We do 10,000 miles a year. It's a 100-mile car. It's irrelevant. But in the fleet ownership model for trucking or for robo-taxis or for Ubers, that's hugely relevant, right? You can do 100,000 miles a year. You use that lifetime. So the cost per mile of the car drops dramatically, right? It's just one millionth of the total cost of the upfront cost of the vehicle for each mile travel, right? And so, because fuel costs and maintenance costs are so low as well, the operating costs are extraordinarily low. We think you get to a point where actually transport will be free, will be given away in cities because they find other mechanisms. There's other ways to monetize the data, sponsorship, advertising, all kinds of other methods that allow the fleet owners to give away transport for free. And that will lead to an even more rapid disruption. And so, yes, transport we think is absolutely on track. Same with electric power, same with food and agriculture. And I think, by the mid-2030s, we'll see each of those three major industries transformed, certainly by 2040. Well ahead of the 2-degree curves that we see the IPCC produce and so on. So yeah, it seems that we're on track. If you know what to look for.
Henrietta wanted to know: can you comment on methods of bringing population along? We know we have tools to do this, but how do we bring people to adopt better practices? Whether it is food, travel, and just consumption.
Yes, so I would maybe challenge the premise of whether we need to. Right? I think we need to adopt these new, more efficient, lower carbon technologies, and I think we need to, vote for those people who are going to help deliver them. But I think we'll respond to other incentives, the economic incentive, for instance. These forms of food, these forms of transport and energy will be cheaper, right? So that's the incentive we'll produce. Now, we can certainly accelerate these processes through subsidy, through carbon taxes, through other interventions in the market. And one of the critical things we'll need to do is to deal with the kind of the power of incumbency, right? Not just incumbent businesses who can influence legislation and policy and the fiscal frameworks that we use, but also in terms of our incumbent mindsets. And I think challenging incumbencies a huge role for us. But I think, our view is actually that individual people, individual agents essentially will respond to those sorts of incentives because they make economic sense. So that's within the power. So I think the idea that we need to persuade people to behave differently is a false assumption, because the economics and the market forces will deliver that behavior change. But I think what we do need to do is kind of open our eyes and see what's coming, to understand the potential, how cheap and how good these products will be. I mean, it's going to be an extraordinary era of essentially abundance, where we decouple from emissions. We'll have almost limitless energy, but no impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and that's transformative.
My favorite troublemaker is asking to grab the mic. I hope it works out. She sometimes has some tech issues. Hazel, I hope you're responding okay. Otherwise, we'll try it again in a few minutes. No? Okay. All right. So I'll take the next question. Beata wanted to know, you mentioned the challenge of regulation and law. Which law and regulation, if you had a free rein, you'll propose to implement, and what would be your target market, starting in the UK? Obviously, from a lawyer.
Right. Well, so first thing I'd want to do is essentially create level playing fields, right? So if you look at energy, or you look at food and agriculture, there are huge subsidies that support the existing ways of doing things, mm-hmm. and they unbalance the playing field. There are also regulations that restrict access to the market, right? So it's very difficult right now. Market structures are such that it's difficult for renewables, certainly distributed renewables, to connect to a grid. It's difficult for new proteins and new foods. There are very slow regulatory cycles that allow them to get into the marketplace and reach the eventual consumer. So, just leveling the playing field, I think, is a critical starting point. Removing the incumbency, and then I think beyond that you can go much further. You can actually incentivize these new technologies, these new products and services, and I think that's a really important thing. And I think there's a kind of role for public education in this as well, to really understand the benefits of what's coming, to take away some of the fear. And I think there is a kind of incumbents playbook that we look at, that incumbents at threat of disruption have used for time immemorial. Everything from kind of lobbying for policies and that support their industry, through to mudding the science, creating doubt about products, and so on and so forth. There's a whole handful of different tactics that have been used, and I think countering that. Almost providing as you referred to earlier, a kind of North Star, something for us to aspire to, that we fully understand and we welcome and we desire, is a really powerful way to counteract some of that. So, I mean, that's where I'd focus initially. Certainly, I think one, level the playing field, and then two, tilt it in favor of the new, if you want to go that far, because ultimately this could be seen as a race to the top, right? That's certainly one of the things we're trying to catalyze with the regions, the governments, the cities that we talk to, is that there's a huge gain for people who lead on this, to develop the industries, develop the technology that underpins this new system. And I think it's incumbent on any region to try and get ahead of this and to lead.
Okay, the head of your fan club in Florida wanted to say something. Okay, Hazel, you can speak now. You just have to unmute your mic.
Thanks.
Oh, you muted your mic again.
Oh, okay, now can you hear me?
I can hear you. We don't see you, but that's okay.
Hi, James. We love your stuff, and we are reporting it on our latest headlines all the time.
Thank you.
It's even better because it's the declining fertility below replacement populations in all mature societies. This was a survey done called Empty Planet, And so basically, women are now in charge of fertility, and the men are getting vasectomies in Texas to support the women they love. And sex is going to be more fun for everyone. So we can overcome consumption of stuff by just enjoying ourselves more. Okay?
That is a happy picture of the future, Hazel. That's it. Actually brings. Was there another question, Hazel? Because it actually brings up a really interesting point. I think I kind of like to make, which is, often when we think about the future, I said this earlier, we kind of assume a lot of what holds today holds in the new system in the future. And so one of those assumptions we have is about population, right? So today, in the current system, we think we kind of understand the basics of what drive population, female education, female empowerment, child healthcare, survival rates, and so on and so forth. There are a series of factors that are pretty well understood now that are driving our birth rates down, and actually in some regions are now below replacement level. And so it looks like we're on track to control population. But in the new system, we're in a world of essentially relative abundance, where no longer do we have to worry about survival, and we have enough, and children are no longer a kind of cost in the way that they are in most of Western society today. Those relationships and and those factors, they're variables, they're not constants. They might change, and we might see them go either way. Either we might have many less children, or we might have many more children, and it's difficult to know at this point in time. So it kind of raises some really interesting points. But I prefer your future, I think, Hazel.
Mark wanted to know, in your introduction, you mentioned the RethinkX identifies disruptive technologies related to climate change. Can you elaborate on the signals that you use to do this?
Yeah. So cost and capability of technology is one of the core. So let me kind of step back. So the way we organize ourselves is really kind of around matter, energy, and information, right? The foundations of our physical world. And beyond that, we then look at, what we think of as the five foundational sectors of the economy. So, food, materials, energy, information, and transport, right? We term the and there are reasons for that I won't go into now. So, what really drives disruption of the cost and capabilities of competing technologies, right? And so we look at cost curves. That's very important. But technologies often improve over multiple parameters beyond just a single measure of cost, right? So batteries, for instance, yes, we've seen an extraordinary cost curve and reduction in cost of batteries over the past decades, but they've also improved in terms of cycles, how many charge cycles you can go through, right? And that makes a huge difference, right? If you improve, from 500 cycles to 5,000 cycles, that's equivalent to certainly in a fleet model and transport for, a 10x reduction in cost, right? So we're seeing them improve in terms of energy density and all kinds of other ways. So, it's important to remember that there are multiple factors involved in the competitiveness technology. So that's kind of our starting point. But then we're looking at all kinds of other factors that can influence adoption as well. And I can go into more details if you want. But that cost and capabilities are the kind of the core of our modeling, or at least the starting point. And then understanding the feedback loops becomes the kind of the next phase of the research work.
Daniela wanted to know, what is your point of view about the acceptance of these disruptive technologies by consumers and the products resulting from it, like the lab-grown salmon, as well as the resistance from the industries itself, all the farmers who would lose their basis of existence, for example?
Yeah, and that's clearly a concern. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we set up RethinkX, was to try and provide the data and analysis that would help us prepare for what's coming, rather than stumbling blindly into, into disruption. So, for communities affected, I mean, it's transformational, and it could be transformationally bad if we get it wrong. But I think there are, if we can see what's coming, we can certainly make plans. So, consumer acceptance is a variable as well, right? It's something that changes. So, we've seen historically that taking consumer surveys today on, the expectation of our future actions is actually a pretty bad way to judge them, right? A lot of people today are concerned about getting in an autonomous vehicle or concerned about consuming these novel proteins. But actually, in historic disruptions, we've seen that hasn't been a barrier, and people change their opinion pretty quickly. And that's what I think will happen with these foods. I mean, yes, they seem somewhat scary, but I think over time, we'll each go on our adoption curve. I mean, it's not, in some ways, buying an electric car is a big purchase, right? It's a one-off purchase. You either commit to gasoline or you commit to electric. But with these food stuffs, you can just try them. You can go on your own S-curve. You can start with a very small amount and over time increase how much of these novel proteins you eat. And so I think once people try them, we see the health data over time. We understand, the impacts and all the benefits that come with them across, all these different parameters. I don't see, I see there being resistance for sure, but not to any extent. I mean, really, what we're seeing in that industry today is that the constraint is supply and not demand. That, you've seen Impossible Burgers go into Burger King, right? And it's now I think the best-selling late-night delivery food that there is in the US. And so it's these are, there will undoubtedly be resistance, but I think we risk overstating it when we look at kind of consumer surveys today. I think people will become more and more comfortable with it when the science begins to kind of catch up. But yes, I mean, the effect on communities and the effect on industries built around those essentially dying or obsolete industries, will be profound. But what is over the hill is a much better world if we get it right. And I think that's the issue. What we don't want to do is stop disruption and protect. It's like trying to protect coal jobs today. There are communities that have been destroyed by the transformation and the move away from coal and coal mining. The right answer, I don't think, is to prop up that obsolete and dying industry, because the subsidies will get bigger and bigger every year. It'll become more and more expensive. Everyone will suffer because we pay higher energy prices and so on and so forth. So, that's not the answer. The answer is to work with those communities to enable the transformation of those communities, to create new jobs and create new livelihoods for those communities. It's not to prop up old industries. We need to be aware of all the impacts that come with these transformations, and we need to have a plan to mitigate for the adverse consequences that come with them.
Sylvia had an important question. When proposing to rewild land or anyway push for changes in land management, how do you relate this to the rights of indigenous people and local communities? Land is not often a blank table on which anyone can plan and act at own will.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, I think what we see is the potential, with a disruption of livestock farming, to create other uses for that land. Now, region by region, in every part of the world, there'll be different issues that we need to deal with, and different preferences for what we do with that land, and different ownership structures and different communities affected. And I think we need to be aware of that. And I don't think there's a blanket solution here. But what we're talking about are the possibilities that emerge with this transformation, and it is globally across land use for livestock farming. We'll see the potential to transform that land use, and we might choose to go down the path of regenerative farming. We might choose to go down the path of taking that land back to a kind of pre-industrial landscape. Or we might choose to go further and take it back to a pre-Neolithic landscape and rewild it. or anything in between, or any combination. We might choose to use it to allow people to spread out a little bit, and allow our communities to spread out into some of that land. And it will depend on local preferences and local interests and so on and so forth. And I think the earlier we begin to plan for that, the better. I think now, before it happens, it's a time for us to be beginning to plan for that, to beginning to bring all those competing interests that we might see for that land together, to be able to make a kind of longer term strategy. Because once this gets underway, it gets much messier and much more difficult to have those conversations. So I would be encouraging, governments and regions and interest groups around the world to begin to think about, what the best use for that land might be today.
Okay. Henrika had a question. In this paragon of new technologies providing the solution to our climate change challenges, how do we ensure that developing countries are included? At this moment, producing food in these countries has become very expensive due to climate change.
Yeah. No, it's a very real issue, and there are constraints there. There are almost some preconditions that we need to meet, to allow regions of the world to participate in this transformation. And we need, functional governance structures. We need access to capital. We need access to information. But there are elements of this transformation that are hugely equalizing globally, right? And so if you think of the energy system, for instance, right, there are some attributes of the emerging system that are transformational socially, right? And by that I mean two things. First of all, they're distributed and they're modular, right? So at the moment, the problem we have in much of the developing world is that with the kind of conventional centralized electric power systems that we have, there's not much incentive to roll those systems out to rural populations or populations in the developing world, because demand is so low. Right? It's distributed and it's low because they're centralized systems with very high infrastructure costs. Right? They can't service. There's no economic rationale for rolling those systems out in the developing world. We don't have kind of dishwashers and air conditioners and all the other things that consume huge amounts of energy. So the fact that they're distributed and they're modular, so they're scalable. So supply is scalable to match demand, right? And that's huge. So you can build these at any scale, right? And they can make economic sense. So that's a huge thing. But the fact that they're distributed means you don't need a top-down intervention. You don't fall into the problems of dysfunctional governance or financing structures. It enables a kind of bottom-up, much more entrepreneurial system to emerge to deliver, the supply of a distributed energy system. But it's also most of the developing world is going to have a dramatically lower cost of energy than the West. So, we've done some analysis, and I haven't explained this yet because we're short of time. But very quickly, is the electric power system that's emerging is fundamentally different in its properties to the current centralized system we have today. Right, the way we build a 100% renewable energy system, solar, wind, and batteries, is to massively overbuild solar or wind supply. That's how we get through the seasonality problem, the problem of low supply during the winter, the darkest day of the year. And because it's on such a fast cost curve, that'll still be the cheapest energy system we can build in any part of the world. But the dynamics of that system are that if you can meet demand on the darkest day of winter, then for the rest of the year, you get a massive oversupply, right? You get essentially a superabundance of free energy. And that's going to happen. And we call that superpower. And that's going to transform industry after industry. But the dynamics of the system, because most of the developing world are in equatorial zones, they actually need far less oversupply to meet the demands. And they've got far better solar resource. And so you're going to have far lower costs. So we've modeled, for instance, India against Germany. And India will have a cost of energy about a fifth of the cost in Germany. Right? So it's deeply equalizing. It's deeply so we can get these systems delivered. Actually, what we might see is an incredible kind of virtuous cycle where the developing world has the lowest cost of energy, attracts more investment, creates more education opportunities, and so on, and entrepreneurial opportunities, and you see a kind of virtuous cycle of development. But it will only happen if we get this right and fully understand how we go about doing that.
Ben, I have to apologize because we're running out of time, and I promised James that we would stop in 60 minutes. We still have a virtual mixer. James, you're more than welcome to stay. If you have to leave, I'll understand that. But just everyone stick around. You just have to re-log in and choose your camera. So we're going to go right to the mixer. Thank you so much. And hope to see you